Hello, Charmaine Wilkerson, and welcome to this dialogue about your wonderful book, which is called Black Cake originally, but in Romanian, it's, I don't know, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. It's The Sweet Taste of Home. It's called in Romanian. So first of all, welcome to this dialogue. Congratulations for the book. And I had one first question that, concerns one of the covers. Your book now, which is a bestseller, has more than one cover. And on one of the covers, there is a spoon. And I wanted to know if that's a real spoon, if that's the spoon used to make the cake in the novel, or I don't know if there is another story related to that spoon.
That's interesting. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you. I'm just so excited about having this book reach readers in Romania or in the Romanian language, because I'm a reader first, so I get very excited about books, and it's a real privilege to have a story I've written shared with other people. About the spoon, everyone was talking about the idea. When I say everyone, the original publisher and the designer for the cover, the idea of the cake in the story, and mixing making the recipe, and we talked about a spoon, and the designer came up with this spoon. So the spoon is real, but it is not the spoon used by anyone in my family or believed to be used by Eleanor in the story of this family and this cake.
I understand. I'm a little bit disappointed. But anyway, if you come to Romania, we'll go to the antique shops and stuff like that, and we'll find the spoon. Because for me, I saw that spoon, and I believe for a minute there that is the real spoon which you used in order to do that cake.
Sorry
And
to
that was going
disappoint.
No.
But you like spoons. You
Yes.
collect spoons from different
and
places.
especially those kind of old spoons. So that you can see there, that's not a simple supermarket, or I don't know, something retail, let's say, spoon, but it's kind of a thought over spoon, something which has a history, and it relates quite well to the novel, because the novel is a story of a family that travels from one island to another, and then to the United States. And there is also the cake, which is at the center of it, but also there is history all over the place. And that way of making a spoon is also a quick and simple way to focus on the history of a common object. This is something that is found time and time again in the novel also. So I thought it was a mirror to the novel.
But you did pick up on something, Florin, that is important in this novel, and to which I can relate personally too, and that is the idea of the importance of everyday objects, of objects that might not seem to be very important to someone else, but which nonetheless are like channels to carry stories in our lives. They carry memories, they carry stories, they carry culture. And so, it certainly makes sense in the context of this novel.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the characters in the novel, because they get mixed up in life and in the hardships of life, sometimes they end up not having so much, or having just regular objects, and those regular objects become invested with a personal kind of power. And that's also again, part of history, part of personal history, part of culture, part of group history. And that's why it's interesting. And that brings me to another, let's say, big, I wouldn't call it object, because it's delicious. So we end up to the cake, which is a centerpiece of the novel and of the many stories inside the novel. And I have to ask, do you know how to make a rum cake? Do you have a preference? I don't know, recipe? Do you have some tips on how to make, let's say, the best rum cake? I mean, you give some tips in the novel, but do you personally, does that ring a bell for you personally?
It really does, Florin. I do know how to make the cake that is used in this novel. And the best recipe is not mine, but my own mother's. And there is a connection. Now, I should say two things right away. First of all, this is not an autobiographical story. And second, I did not set out to write a story about a cake. It's not a story about a cake, but it does have a cake as a prominent kind of character, right? Or prop.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this idea, this cake sort of showed up in the story as I was writing it. It wasn't there at the beginning, but the moment it showed up in the sort of broad field of my imagination, I understood the connection to real life. And this goes back to your comment and your question. Several years before I started writing this story, a younger member of my family texted me on my mobile phone asking for my mother's recipe for that traditional Caribbean fruitcake, and said, do you have that recipe? And I was surprised that he would care, because in my family, we are a family of people who have grown up in different ways, in different countries. Many of us don't even look alike. And yet we identify in some way with one another, right? We have some sense of being family, of having affection among us. And it just started me thinking about this. I thought, why did I think he wasn't interested in that recipe? And isn't it interesting how each of us chooses to hold something close to our hearts, depending on the way in which exactly the stories attached to recipes, the stories attached to objects. You mentioned spoons earlier. And so I jotted down a few notes. You're a writer too, so you understand. You might write a few notes. It doesn't mean it has to be a story, right? It doesn't mean it has to be a poem, but I wrote that down. Fast forward to me writing a series of stories, not realizing I was writing a novel. Suddenly, this novel begins to take shape, and the cake arrives like a little personality, a little character. And I made that connection. I made that connection to the recipe in my own life, my mother's recipe, and the fact that my mother's recipe had a huge impact on other people and their memories. My cake would not have such an impact on anyone. It's fine, but it's not like my mother's. It's still tasty. but
if I think that in order to make that such wonderful cake, it comes from also passion, but also that passion comes from hardship. So in the end, it's bittersweet. In a way, you didn't have that many, or hopefully you don't have that many hardship as your parents do, and then you don't get that passion. But in the end, they also get this passion because they, lived in a time where more hardship was, available. But for me, I mean, my first idea was just like Chekhov, when he said that when you have a play and in the first act you have a gun, then until the end, until the third act, you have to use that gun. I thought that your example was, I don't know, somewhat better because you had a cake. So you started with a cake, you started the recipe, you started with the mom that is, going to prepare that cake. And I can guarantee that until the end, you would really, really want to taste that cake. That cake, becomes larger than life. And maybe just like, I don't know, if you didn't set up to write a story about cake, it ended up being a story about a family, but also a story about cake, because the food that we eat tells a lot about us, about every one of us.
Food is a language. It really is a language. And, I don't know, for people who haven't read the story, we know that we can't say too much about what happens to the cake. but the story, which is multi-generational, goes back and forth between the past and present, and also goes from an island in the Caribbean to the United Kingdom to the United States. And what happens near the beginning of this story in the present day in the United States is you have this brother and sister. They're adults. Sadly, they lose their mother, and they must come together and set aside their own differences. They haven't seen each other for years. They're not getting along. Yes. They must set aside their differences to deal with their mother's death. And they find that their mother has left a small cake for them, this traditional Caribbean fruit cake. And it's a bit of a mystery. Why would she do that when she knew she was dying? And then she leaves this lengthy voice recording, hours and hours of stories. And eventually you come to understand the importance of that cake and what her children will need to do before the novel ends. And again, it's this interweaving of story, memory, symbol that emerges in this book, you know, and so the cake is just this prop it's in the fridge, and you think, why this cake? And then it, as you mentioned, it expands to become a symbol of everything from family and togetherness to sisterhood to also difficult memories and mystery.
Exactly. Just like you mentioned, so this fruit cake, being, you know, a mixture of different fruits, it has a mixture of different stories and of different themes. Which one of these themes which surprised me a little bit is also, you know, among all these stories, there is also this story about a brother and a sister, and both of them are Black, but we learn in the story that the let's say the nuance of their skin provides a different experience for each of them. So the sister, being lighter, has a vastly different experience than her brother, which is somewhat, you know, darker. And also this same experience become, you know, richer, or sometimes, you know, hard, sometimes difficult. We see that, you know, in current events, this rings again a lot of truth. How did you experience, let's say, do you have a brother? Do you have sisters? Is this, you know, taken up from real life, or was this again imagined, this relationship between the brother and the sister?
So on the surface, there will appear to be many similarities between my own experience, my own family, and the novel. Why? Because it deals with American people who were born to a couple from the Caribbean. It deals with migration, and we're talking about a family of various colors, let's say, you know, a family in which, although they sort of identify as being one, they do experience life in different ways based on the way they look and based on other elements in their lives and other elements in their identity. But this is not autobiographical. And so what I find fascinating about the imagination is, I think of the imagination as being this open field, like an agricultural field at a farm, that is seeded with elements from everything that we live, our own experiences, our observations, the fact that I was a journalist in my first career. I have seen so many things that I've not experienced. And all of that, I find, goes into this, this field of the imagination, this fertile ground. And so to answer your question, Florin, I would say that I'm certainly aware, it's certainly a reality of contemporary life as well as in the past, certainly in the United States, certainly in the Caribbean and the West Indies, even though people didn't always want to acknowledge that your appearance, even when two people, like the brother and sister, identify as exactly the same thing, African Americans, Black, they don't think anything else of it, but they do experience life differently because of their appearance, excuse me, just as other characters in this novel experience life differently based on where they were born, their gender, other elements in their lives, their professional choices. One of the things that a number of different characters have in common in this novel is they, a number of them feel fairly comfortable in their own identities. Each has chosen an identity, an idea of who they are, but they actually struggle often against the expectations, stereotypes, and prejudices of other people. And so even when you feel that you are secure in your sense of self, who am I? This is who I am. You may struggle, and this is a reality for many people in the world, in many different countries, many different cultures. There are expectations And other people want you to act in a certain way, look a certain way, choose a certain profession, love a certain person based on how they see you. And so I'm fascinated by what helps us to form our identities. I'm fascinated by the ways in which we choose a sense of home and family and tradition. And that is part of what keeps me writing, and that's part of what went into this story. I come from a multicultural family, a family of different colors, a family in which we've lived in different places, as mentioned before. And so I think it comes naturally that I think a lot about identity, but I'm just fascinated by the power of the stories we tell, of the things we save, of the recipes, of the songs, of the spoons that we hold close to our hearts to help to form our identities. And like it or not, other people's expectations of us, other people's views of us, whether or not we agree, still have an impact on us. And so I'm fascinated by the push and pull between identity and how we navigate the external world, the world around us.
Exactly. So identity and shaping one's identity, and also how the society, how the times we live in shape our identity. That's also part of the story. And you reminded me now of the society's expectations and all the other around us, all their expectations of us or of the character brings to mind the story of the mother, because the novel starts with the mother, with the dying mother, unfortunately, but she has an example for her kids. So, for instance, she being black and from the islands, you wouldn't expect in the period where she was living in, you wouldn't expect her to be a surfer, but she's an avid surfer because she comes from the islands and she's in love with the sea and with the ocean. Things which fascinated me, and the story develops when she gives as a gift to her kids this idea of, this is such a big part of my identity that I just need to show it to you, and I just need to live it. And she lives it so passionately that all the other people around her, they cannot actually become the slaves of stereotype, because they see the passion in her, and then she's okay, she can live her passion alone. She can live as a surfer with the ocean. And I found it to be a wonderful gift from a mother to her kids, but also a wonderful story of how to live your passion and how to, build your own identity, because there weren't other people that taught her to be this way. She taught herself to be this way.
And it's interesting you say it that way, because also one could say, to what extent did she teach herself, and to what extent was her identity formed, like it or not, by her strong, visceral connection to the natural world? Because that's another thing that a number of characters have in common, and that is there are a number of characters with a very strong attachment to the sea. And at least one character who's very attached to the earth, the land, the soil. But that helps to form her identity, and she simply can't shake it, even after everything she's been through. So you do mention the surfing, and she passes that on to her children, especially her son. And yes, it breaks a stereotype, because her children are Southern Californians. And even to this day, although things have changed, when you think of a Southern Californian surfer, you're not necessarily thinking of, a 60-something Black woman out there surfing, and you're certainly not thinking of a Black ocean scientist, or, we have our stereotypes.
Exactly.
So she does go against those, yes.
But yeah, to pick up on this idea which you said, I think that especially in the United States, I've seen that. I don't know how to interpret that, but this connection between nature and people, because people of all colors, of all ages, we are meant to be close to nature. I mean, nature is in our blood. It's something that drives us as human beings, but somehow there are groups of people that want to be as far away or as further away from nature as possible. And I find that to be quite, let's say, dangerous and quite a story. Again, part of the novel, there is also this story where we actually need to take care of the ocean. We need to take care of this planet because we're in this climate, let's say, crisis that we are, just because many of the people have lost this link with nature, which is should be fundamental for all of us.
It's interesting to see, you know, the things that you're finding in this novel, because it is a story that on the surface is about a mother whose children find out she had a hidden past. And that past is about to catch up, not with her because she's sadly just passed away, but with them. And it's going to change their lives, but it also will change their sense of identity. But it is true that again, there are these characters, including her son in particular, who have very strong connections to the natural world, despite the fact that they're living lives that take advantage of all the not so natural things as well, the technologies and the advantages of modern life and so forth. So it's interesting to see that you found that in the story because it emerges. And, you know, I did not set out to write any of these. These are characters who came to me. And I don't know if you find this when you're writing, Florin, that we think we have an idea of what we're writing, but the characters or the scenes or the moods lead us, and we sort of have to follow.
Yeah, they have their own voice, and actually maybe even if we start a certain way, they have the personalities of their own, and we need to let them speak in order to tell their story, because otherwise the story doesn't ring true and it doesn't work. I wanted to ask you kindly if you would like to read your favorite passages or your favorite 2 pages from the book.
Well, I will never read my favorite 2 pages. And why is that? Because they give everything away. I love those pages. So I'll never do that.
We wouldn't want to give everything away. We just want to recommend the book. It is a wonderful book, worth reading. I recommend it to everybody. But yeah, if you could make a selection of paragraphs that don't give any of the story away, but also give a taste of this wonderful novel.
Sure, and I'm having fun with what you said. Thank you, Florin. You know, you were talking about the sea. You were talking about the connection to the natural world. Maybe I should say, again, for people who have not read this book, that we talked about the cake, we talked about the family, but this story is multi-generational. And when the children listen to their mother's story about the past, and she starts to talk about a bunch of other people who lived before, she talks about these 2 teenage girls who are obsessed with the sea. There you go again, this connection to the natural world. And they are very strong swimmers. And they are different from what's expected of them as young ladies living in the 1960s in their particular town, in their particular country, their island in the Caribbean. And so I'm going to read something from that, setting the scene from the past. This is a chapter that again sort of sets up these 2 teenage girls on the cusp of womanhood. Until the bay became famous, they had it all to themselves. Pull, pull, pull. No self-respecting islander would go out there on a weekday without a boat or a surfboard. Only Covey and her friend Bunny. Pull, pull, pull. From time to time, the movie stars and writers who kept homes farther up the coast would come by with their glamorous friends and stretch out on the sand. But most afternoons, the beach was deserted when the girls arrived. Pull, pull, pull. On Sundays, Covey and Bunny behaved like the other 15-year-old girls, strolling along the shore in their matching 2-piece swimsuits, poking sticks into beached jellyfish, burying each other up to their necks in sand, eating fresh snapper and cassava cakes cooked on an open fire by Fishy and his wife, and washing off their fingers in the breakers afterwards. Fishy was an institution around there. He'd been selling lunches made with his freshly caught fish since Covey and Bunny's own fathers had been young boys. He'd seen Bunny's father go to war for Britain and come back across the oceans to raise his 2 children, unlike some of the others who turned right around and gone back to England or Wales or what have you. He'd seen Cubby's pa go from being a skinny little thing, as he'd told Cubby more than once with a chuckle, to a skinny big thing. And now these boys were men, holding court around Fishy with bottles in their hands and arguing about the island's independence from British rule. Some weekends, when Covey's pa wasn't full of drink, he would drive the girls and their friends up the coast to the falls. They'd run under the cascade, they'd run under the cascade, yelping from the cold rush of the water. "Look at me, Pa," Covey would shout. "Look at me." It was a good day when she could get him to throw back his head in laughter and slap the side of his thigh. It was a good day when she could feel that she was still more important to Pa than a bunch of smelly roosters fighting to the death. Then on weekdays, Covey and Bunny would pull on their swim caps and Covey would revert to her truest self. I'm just going to jump ahead in this chapter.
Sure.
To a little bit of what their experience swimming together in the sea, often alone, was like. Their island was one of the smaller countries on Earth, but it had one of the world's largest natural harbors. There were always rumors going around of what might be lurking in its waters. Everyone on the island had a shark story. Sharks that left nothing but a man's torso to wash ashore. Sharks that lunged when someone threw a dead dog off a cliff. Sharks seen circling a sandbar off the southern coast. But in her entire life, Covey had never seen so much as a shark fin in the water. Barracudas, yes. But she wondered if shark sightings weren't like ghost stories, tales that you didn't quite believe, but that left you feeling afraid all the same. How is that? Is that enough?
Yes, thank you very much, because I personally liked a lot. I loved actually that example of sharks and people throwing dead dogs to the sharks, which is unexpected, but also bittersweet. It gets you to be right there. Now it's time for another question, let's say a little bit more personal, because the novel tries to answer to this question, like you said, in order to frame a little bit. So we have a dying mother that lives her story for her children. So she has raised her children for a big part of their lives, and they think they know her. But in the end, they find out they know very little of her and of her experience and of her history. Do you think that we can actually know the stories or the secrets of our parents? I mean, your novel tries to answer this question in an affirmative way, but do you really think that we can find, or we can completely understand the experiences of our parents? Or if we can find out their secrets, if they let us know their secrets?
Well, the relationship between one generation and the other is always fascinating, because so often those of us who are children, we're all children, even when we grow up, we tend to think of our parents as not understanding us. They don't know what it's like, how can they understand? And so often no one takes the time to think, well, what about understanding our parents? They tell us stories, we roll our eyes, yeah. But the bottom line is that, and this goes back to the idea of identity. If we form our identities and our sense of family and our sense of culture and tradition through the stories that are handed down to us by the former generations, the previous generations, or sometimes from one part of the world to another, as in the case of migrants or immigrants, then I think that we need to consider also the power of the stories we don't know. And so I don't know that we can fully know everything. I think there's always room to learn more. There's always room to increase comprehension, and it can be fun too. But I think the truth is I think that the truth is that in most people's lives, there are stories that are not told, and certainly the previous generation. And I'm fascinated by the power which the untold stories have as well. So in the case of Byron and Benny, the brother and sister who discover their mother has a hidden past, the stories that were untold helped to shape their identities. Now that they're about to find out that there's so much they didn't know, where does that leave them? It actually leaves them in great tumult. It actually leaves them feeling betrayed. Their mother wants to share more, and she believes she's doing her duty, and she believes it's time to explain why she hasn't told them more. But for Byron and Benny, the brother and sister, being made to hear the truth feels like an act of betrayal. So this goes back to your question, Florin. I think that we can certainly know more about other people, but how many times has a parent or someone else who's older not told a story because they felt they'd be judged? How many times have previous generations not shared all of the truth with our own because they were afraid of what we would think?
Yes, and also it's a big part in the novel, and in this story is also the idea of wanting to protect your children. So they are living in the United States in a completely different environment than her own, than the mother's own environment, than of the island, than in Great Britain also. So the idea is that's the duty of a parent, the idea of protecting the child, and then their idea where Byron and Benny, they feel betrayed that they don't know this part of their parents' experience. But the idea is they weren't mature enough, and in a way, not even at this age, this, let's say, adult age, they're the little kids that don't understand their parents, and they didn't actually take the time to to remember the bad stuff or the more painful stuff. They just lived in this wonderful story. They went with the story that their parents gave them, but the reality is life is much more harsher than that, and kids are not always prepared to hear the truth or to understand their parents. I completely agree with you. So
and you touched on an important point, which is that what we'll learn through the story, without giving too much away, is that their mother, Eleanor, has her reasons initially. She feels she's acting coherently in concealing the truth. Yes. And this goes on for years, and then she wants to correct the situation but feels the conditions are not right. And one of the conditions is that her own two children are not talking to one another, and her daughter hasn't come home for years. So there are misunderstandings all the way around, and they are created in part because the daughter also does not express everything. And even the brother has not shared everything about his difficulties. That's natural. We don't share everything. We also have our feelings of privacy, or maybe we feel other people aren't interested. But the thing about writing fiction that I love is you can step into other people's heads, and what you learn is that maybe if we all had a bit more empathy, or just took a moment to listen before reacting, we might be able to achieve more in our relationships. Of course, that's the ideal, and exactly. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, not for any of us.
Exactly. Sometimes it's so much easier to be a kid and to ignore everything and to think that, my parents, they have a wonderful life. And that's it. Everything is fine and peachy, but in the end, reality is much, much harsher. And that brings me to another question, because in this novel, there is a fair shade of pain, of sorrow, which is understandable because it talks about life, and life is not always pink. We find even death, a lot of death in this novel, but just some glimpses of sensuality or sex. Is this a choice of yours, of the choice of the author, or things just happen this way?
Which choice, the difficult part or the
No,
sensuality?
the choice of putting much less light, let's say, on the sensual part of the relationships that exist in the novel, or the relationship between the characters and nature, which for me personally, let's say, it was something to admire and to read about, and also about sexuality, because I found it to be a great counterbalance for death and for sorrow. There is also the other part. I mean, but this part, let's say, this wonderful part is put much less into light than the other more painful. And this
Right.
was the question: if this is something that was meant to be like that, or this is something which happened.
I understand. I think it sort of happened that way. I do, I think two of the things that in writing this novel, I hoped would emerge were the idea that there is love in many different forms. Yeah. So between friends, between siblings, parent and child. So it's not always the love that we associate with sexuality, for example, but also sensuality comes in different forms. The water, the earth, the food, the experience of making food. So the actual, there are young lovers in this story. And
Yeah.
yes, we'd like to see more of the young lovers. I think it just sort of emerged that way, the idea that they had a little of their privacy. So we sort of know they're together, but we don't know everything, because the children are listening to the mother's stories of these people they've never met. And so as she recounts this, she recounts it as if she's telling a story. And there are a few passages where you step into those people's lives, but you just don't step fully into everything. And so it sort of remains that it touches enough on these scenes, I hope, to give people a sense of what they can imagine, because, I trust the reader to imagine many things if I touch enough on certain points. But without a doubt, there's a lot of strife and there are difficult moments in the book. So some of those are described in very clear terms. It's true.
Yes. And it's understandable. I mean, we're not talking about easy lives, not of the parents and not of the kids, which is, in a way, it was surprising, because in a certain way, the kids becoming or being so independent of their parents, they don't end up profiting from their lessons, and they end up doing some of those mistakes, and living a hard life instead of being together with their parents and making the most of their lessons. But such is life. Some things are meant to happen in a way. Also, we come to one of my, let's say, my favorite topics, and which is that of the sea and that of the ocean. There is the sensual relationship with this part of nature, but there is also this complex relationship where the ocean is so wonderful but could take everything away, because nature is that powerful, especially in the monsoon season and so on. How is your relationship with the sea or with the ocean?
I'm certainly not an open water swimmer, and I am not a surfer. But as a child, I spent, many hours playing in the sea, and I still love being by the coast. I've lived in a number of different cities in my life, and I've just about always lived in coastal cities. And I consider that the sea is important. So my view of water in general, but in specifically the sea or the ocean, is the idea that one end is connected to the other. So, wherever you are, what's going on the other side? And there are all of these different currents, and there's an entire world below.
Yes, indeed.
The shapes, the mountains, the animals, the creatures. So I am just fascinated by the sea, and I think that it is a metaphor for everything that we live. The idea of connection, the idea of currents and tides that can change, the idea of the potential of being lost or scooped up or hurt by the immensity of something. but also the potential to be buoyed, kept afloat, lifted up by the immense beauty of something, the immense power of something. And certainly in this novel, there are a couple of references to the idea for a couple of the characters, a sense of continuity between what we consider to be life and what we call death.
Yes.
So you sense that there's a continuity for those characters. It's almost a spiritual kind of connection, where they almost feel that if they're in contact with the water, nothing ever quite ends.
Yeah. And in the end, there is this idea or conceptual idea of everything being liquid, everything being a transformation. And we come from the water because we know that life develops first in the ocean and then it came on shore. But it needs, we need water in order to live. We need water to tell our stories and to be linked to our past and hopefully to our future also. So yeah, I mean, that's the idea which binds everything together. I think we got to the end. I would like to thank you and congratulate you again for this wonderful novel, which I recommend to all your readers in Romania. So this was a wonderful dialogue with Charmaine Wilkerson about Black Cake, which is translated in Romania, The Sweet Taste of Home. And in the end, if you'd like, or if you have a message for your readers in Romania, please address it.
Thank you so much, Florin. I am so grateful to Litera and to readers in Romania for giving me an opportunity to share a story that I've written, because before I wrote a novel, I was just a little girl who loved books, you know, and I still am that little girl who loves books. And so it is a great privilege to be able to share a story that I've written with other readers. And I'm most grateful to the translator and Litera for making it possible to share this story with readers of the Romanian language.
Thank you. Thank you once again for your presence here and for having a talk with us about your novel.
Thanks to you. Thanks so much, Florin. It's been a pleasure.